Okay, in this video, I'm going to go just briefly over the Basic tab. Those are the main sort of overall editing tab that's available here in the Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw editing dialog box. Now, I just want to give a little tour of this dialog box sort of generally before I get into the specifics of using this panel. But when you open a RAW file, before you get into the main editing interface in Photoshop, you will come here to the Camera Raw ACR editing dialog box, I guess it is. And there are a few different ways you can navigate around and a few different areas where you can edit. Up here on the top, there's a whole variety of edits that you can do and controls that you can use, from something simple like the hand tool to move you around, to some white balance tools, crop, transform, and some more focused edits like the adjustment brush, the graduated filter, etc. So these are specific tools, not unlike your toolbox in Photoshop. And I'm not going to cover those in this video. I'll cover those in a later video. In this video, I'm going to talk mainly about this basic editing tab with these various sliders. Now, you should keep in mind that over here on the right, the basic tab is actually the first main tab for editing, but hidden underneath it are a whole number of other tabs with all kinds of specialized editing functions available. Again, I'm not going to cover those in this particular video. YouTube limits the amount of length I can have in one video, and so does frankly, my ability to make a video without screwing up. So I'm going to just talk in this video about this particular part of the interface. So I have here a raw image that I captured in the studio, and I think it needs a bit of work. This ultimately ended up on the cutting room floor, but I think it's a nice image to use for an exercise in editing. And over here, if you look at the basic tab, there's a little bit of information here. First, it tells me that my f-stop was 20. I shot for 0.8 of a second, ISO 100 with a 50mm lens. And then it also has my white balance as it was recorded. This is my white balance as shot, as well as some tabs to change the exposure and contrast. Those are sort of all the areas right in here, the sliders here. These three sliders control sharpness and midtone contrast, and these control vibrance and saturation. So I'm actually going to start here in the middle with the contrast and exposure sliders. And looking at this photograph before I begin to edit, the things I notice about it are that overall I think it's a little bit underexposed. It could come up just a bit. We're losing a little bit of the play in the shadows here. I mean, there's shadow detail there, but I think just for the overall quality of the image, this image could use to be a little bit brighter. So I'm going to up just my overall exposure just a little bit. I might pop the contrast just a little bit. Maybe I'll make the shadows a little deeper and the highlights a little bit brighter, perhaps just really for the purposes of the exercise. I will just maybe give it a little bit of increased sharpness via the texture and clarity sliders. And again, just for the purposes of example, I will probably play with the vibrance and saturation just a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is play with or I shouldn't say play with, I'm going to use the tabs here, and actually I'm going to set them back to where they are. Sorry, I knew it needed more exposure. And if you look here, you can see that this was the original exposure for the image, which is a bit dim. Now, the difference between the sliders here are that if you move the exposure slider, it will overall change the entirety of the exposure. So if I pull it way over here to the right, it's way, way, way overexposing. And if I go way here to the left, it brings it almost to black. Obviously, there's not a lot of cases where you might do that, but you might find yourself moving somewhere within this range if your overall picture was over or underexposed. The contrast slider I don't ever really use because I find that the 4 sliders below it do a better job of controlling contrast in a more nuanced way. If you move the highlight slider or the shadow slider, those sliders will affect only the areas, let's say, that are in the brightest third of the highlights or the darkest third of the shadow area, so the darkest third of the pixels or the brightest third of the pixels. Whereas the whites and black sliders will do something a little bit different. If you move the highlights, you'll see that it really just affects the areas that are already, I would say, in the brightest sort of third of that pixel range or that brightness range. And if I go down here, it does overall darken the image, but it's mostly affecting those highlight areas. If I use the shadow slider, likewise, it will affect sort of I would call it the darkest third of the tonal range. And if I slide it over here, it makes it much darker. If I go here, it'll open my shadows way, way up. And if in particular, if you look here at this sunflower, you can see what it's doing to that shadow area because it's really making that open up quite a bit. If you want to go back to the default 0 setting, just double click on this tab and it'll zing right back. If you move the whites and the black sliders, I equate this very much to what happens when you move your edge sliders, not the gamma slider, but the highlight and the shadow sliders in a levels adjustment. It's essentially remapping your brightest highlight to a brighter white point and or your darkest shadow to a deeper black. Let me show you what I mean. If I move this white point up, what it's essentially doing is taking whatever the brightest pixel is in this image to begin with and making it even brighter and pushing it more and more towards white and sort of pushing that white point over to brighten all the pixels to the point where, of course, this would be absurd and completely blown out. Likewise, if I pull it over to the left, it kind of makes those pixels really dim. If you move the black slider, it will take those shadows and it'll pull more areas into that deep, deep shadow by essentially resetting the black point. Now, these two sliders are great to use if you have an image that is kind of overall flat, perhaps hazy, doesn't really have a true white point or true bright highlight or a true deep shadow. More general contrast adjustments, I find personally, I think they work better in the highlights and shadows here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to actually move my exposure up by just a bit. And I'm not going to go too crazy, but I'll add a little bit of brightness. I'd like to just see a little bit more of the detail that's in here. And then I'm not going to touch my contrast slider, but I might just pop my highlights up just a tiny little bit. I'm just for the purposes of, I guess demonstration, I'll make my highlights a little brighter and my shadows just a little bit deeper just to keep some contrast in there. Now, looking at the image overall, and I know this mainly because I shot the image and I know what it really looked like, I think that this capture is a little bit too warm, a little bit too much towards the yellow, and it's actually a little bit more towards the green than the magenta. If I go back to my color temperature or white balance sliders up here on the top, there's one slider that moves from the really cool blue towards the yellow, and the other one moves between green and magenta. I'm going to go back to as shot, and what I'm going to do is I want to make mine just a little bit cooler here. I'm going to go to about 5,000, I think. Whoops, let me even just type that in. And whoopsie, that wasn't what I meant, one more zero. And I'm going to make this just a little bit more towards the magenta. The reason I'm making it a little more towards the magenta is I know that these flowers have a little flush yellow, but they also have quite a bit of magenta in them as well, and I want to bring that out. So I'm going to go somewhere in this range, and I think that's starting to look nice. Now, if I want to see sort of a before and after, I can click through this area right here, and I like this first left-right before and after. I tend to shoot vertical images, so this works really nicely for me. But if you keep clicking on this, you can scroll through a before after left right view, a before after top bottom, a top bottom split, and then back to just the regular view. So I'm going to go here, and looking at the image on the right, I do think it is quite improved from where we began. I'm going to go back to my single full view, and I'm going to zoom into 100%. And I like to use Command plus honestly on my keyboard, but you can also zoom in right here. And I have quite a bit of good detail here in the image, but I want to zoom into that detail so you can see what's happening as I move these texture and clarity sliders. The texture slider is good for mid-tone contrast or sharpness on areas of really fine texture. The clarity slider is better for mid-tone contrast or sharpness on sort of, I don't know, larger, more blocky, less sort of finely detailed areas. I find the texture slider is a little bit more naturalistic, actually a lot more naturalistic than the clarity slider in most instances. Just by way of comparison, this is the texture slider moved as far as it would go. I would not do this, but this is about what it would look like, and it looks over sharpened, but it doesn't look terrible. And if I do the same with the clarity, it really kind of even takes some of the saturation out in its efforts to make such aggressive sharpness. Now, you would never really do anything that wild, but I'm going to maybe put just a bit of clarity, or excuse me, texture, I don't know, perhaps like that, and just a little tiny, tiny, tiny pinch of clarity. I find that a little goes a long way here. I tend to be one of those people who, I'll be honest, I shoot on a tripod really locked down with a very small aperture. So I feel like sharpness is not a huge crisis for me overall. But I do find when I'm going to print, and I'm always thinking about the final print output, it really helps if you put just a little bit in. Now I'm going to zoom back out again. And I'll do a little left-right split so you can see the before and after of sharpening. And I'll zoom in so you can see that. And this will show you the before after sharpening and also the before after of all my edits. And you'll see on the left is the before and on the right is the after. Brighter, just a little sharper, the color changed just a bit. Now the final thing that I will do here within this tab is I will perhaps just put a little bit of vibrance and saturation in. Vibrance kind of pumps up the overall color of the whole thing, or desaturates it if you pull it down. And saturation really kind of focuses a bit more on those colors that are already a little saturated. I'm going to just give a little bit of each. And again, I don't necessarily always really use these, but I'm doing it just for the purposes of illustration. So you can see all the colors, which are already vibrant to begin with, are a little bit more punched up. Okay. And those are all the controls that are here in the Basics tab. Now if I want to do further edits in Photoshop, I can click here on the open image, or if I simply want Camera Raw to recall these changes that I've made, I can hit done, and the next time I open this raw file, it will appear with these particular edits.